It was a hot afternoon in Southside, a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of New York City. The sun beat down on the asphalt, and the shadows of the buildings stretched long and thin across the sidewalks. Junior, a 14-year-old boy, was walking home after a quick trip to the corner grocery store. He had bought a piece of candy, a simple mint he placed in his pocket. Up until then, Junior's life had been calm, despite the challenges. Raised by his mother, Mrs. Lucia, he stayed away from the troubles many of his friends faced, especially when it came to gangs and the drug trade that dominated the streets. However, that afternoon, something unusual was about to happen. As Junior turned the corner onto his street, two police officers were patrolling the area. One of them, Officer Ryan O'Connor, known for his strict demeanor and subtle prejudices, watched everyone who passed by with suspicious eyes. When he saw Junior, something about the boy's simple appearance seemed to irritate him. Maybe it was the faded cap, or the clothes that, while clean, indicated his family's financial struggles. But O'Connor saw something more: a young black boy walking alone in the neighborhood. To him, that was reason enough for suspicion. "Hey, you there!" O'Connor shouted, crossing the street toward Junior. The boy, startled, stopped immediately. His heart raced, as if anticipating that nothing good was about to happen. "What's the problem, sir?" Junior asked, his voice calm but his expression confused. "Show me what's in your pockets," said the officer, emotionless. His partner, Officer Davis, an older and more cautious man, observed the scene from a distance, hesitant but not intervening. Confused, Junior pulled out the small wrapper from his pocket, a single mint candy. "Just this, sir," he said, holding up the candy for the officer to see. O'Connor narrowed his eyes and, without warning, shoved Junior against the wall. "What else do you have, kid? Who's paying you to sell this crap?" he growled, frisking the teenager harshly. I didn't do anything," Junior exclaimed, now frightened. "Sure you didn't," the officer sneered, ignoring the plea. "You think I'm stupid? This is trafficking, and I'm arresting you." By now, a small crowd had begun to form, made up of neighbors who knew Junior well and were aware he wasn't involved in crime. Mrs. Lucia, who had just arrived from the laundromat where she worked, saw the commotion from a distance and recognized her son. Panic gripped her when she saw him being treated like a criminal. "Let me go. I didn't do anything," Junior shouted, trying futilely to break free from the officer's firm grip. "Quiet, kid." O'Connor handcuffed the boy and, as he led him toward the squad car, turned to the gathering crowd that was beginning to protest. "Lock up the delinquents before they turn into something worse," he said coldly, as if he were doing society a favor. Mrs. Lucia, in tears, begged the other officer, Davis. "He didn't do anything. He was just going home. Please, listen to me." Davis hesitated. He knew O'Connor and was aware of his explosive behavior, but at the same time, he saw a truth in Lucia's eyes that unsettled him. Still, he chose to remain silent, afraid of the consequences of going against his partner. The squad car drove off, taking Junior, handcuffed, to the police station. Behind them, the neighbors' outrage and a mother's cries echoed through the streets. The car carrying Junior weaved through the neighborhood streets, the sound of sirens cutting through the hot night. The boy sat in the back seat, leaning against the window, watching the world outside with eyes blurred by fear and confusion. He tried to understand what was happening, but the situation seemed surreal. How could a simple mint have landed him there, with handcuffs on his wrists, accused of a crime he didn't even understand? In the front seat, O'Connor and Davis remained silent. O'Connor kept a rigid expression, almost proud of his achievement of the day. To him, it was just another day at work, a job that, in his eyes, involved keeping the streets clean, even if that meant distorting reality. He didn't see Junior as a kid, but as a potential problem he had solved. Davis, on the other hand, was restless. He knew something was very wrong. The approach, the accusation, the boy, none of it made sense to Davis, but at the same time, he was trapped by a code of loyalty that kept him from openly questioning his partner. After all, what would happen to his own career if he turned against O'Connor? Upon arriving at the station, Junior was led inside without any explanation. The place was gloomy and cold. The dirty walls and the smell of disinfectant mixed with the sweat of detainees created an oppressive atmosphere. For a 14-year-old, it was terrifying. He had barely stepped away from home, and now he was in a place that felt like the farthest point from his world. When the handcuffs were removed, Junior tried to protest once more, his voice weak, almost pleading. "I didn't do anything, sir. I was just going home." O'Connor looked at him for a moment and gave a short, disdainful smile. "That's what they all say, kid. Now, you're going to sit quietly and wait." He was taken to a cell. The place was small, with rusty metal bars, and the floor was stained by years of grime. Other men were already inside, all staring at him with curiosity. Junior felt the panic rising in his throat, but tried to stay calm. He knew he had to be strong, but how could someone so young face such a situation without breaking down? As he settled into the farthest corner of the cell, trying to avoid the gazes of the other detainees, his thoughts drifted back to home. His mother, Mrs. Lucia, surely knew by now that something was wrong. She would be worried, maybe even looking for him already. The fear of never returning home started to form in his mind, tightening his chest. Across town, Mrs. Lucia was in complete despair. She had rushed to the police station immediately after the incident, trying to find out where her son was. When she arrived, she was met by an officer at the front desk who, with little patience, told her there was nothing she could do that night. "He's been detained. You can speak with the public defender tomorrow. Now go home, ma'am," he said, his tone mixing coldness and disdain. But how could she simply go home? Her son, her only son, was in jail. What could he have done? Lucia knew Junior better than anyone. He wasn't the kind of boy who got into trouble. Raised with discipline and love, Junior was studious, respectful, and stayed far from the problems plaguing the neighborhood, like gangs and drug trafficking. Lucia knew this was all a misunderstanding, but she didn't know how to fix it. In the cell, the night dragged on slowly. The hours seemed to crawl, and Junior could barely sleep. He saw the other prisoners shifting, some dozing off, others just staring into the void, as if that place was all they had left. Junior's mind oscillated between fear and sadness. He felt completely alone, with no one to protect him or help him understand what was happening. Around midnight, a policeman opened the cell door and asked him to follow. Junior, heart pounding, was taken to an interrogation room. There, waiting for him, was a man in an ill-fitting suit, with deep bags under his eyes, a tired expression, and a pile of papers in front of him. It was the public defender, sent to handle Junior's case. To him, the boy was just another number on his long list of minors unjustly detained or arrested for minor offenses. "You're Junior, right?" the lawyer said, without looking up from his papers. "Yes, sir. I didn't do anything. I was just going home," Junior said, still in shock. The lawyer sighed, flipping through the paperwork. "Look, kid, I'm going to be honest with you. I've got a lot of cases to deal with, and it seems like you've been accused of drug possession. Tomorrow we'll see what we can do, but for now, you need to stay calm. Don't say anything to anyone, okay? We'll try to sort this out." The lawyer's words brought no comfort to Junior. He felt as though his life was slipping away from him, and that the people around him, even those who were supposed to help, weren't willing to fight for his innocence. The meeting lasted only a few minutes, and soon Junior was taken back to his cell. Now, he felt even more desperate. No one seemed to believe him. No one seemed to care enough. He was just a kid trapped in a system that didn't offer many chances for boys like him. Meanwhile, Davis continued his internal struggle. He had known something was wrong since the moment O'Connor shoved Junior against the wall and accused him. Now, seeing the boy in that cell, he felt the weight of his own inaction. But it still wasn't enough to break his silence. At least, not that night. The night passed slowly, and Junior, curled up in the corner of the cell, finally succumbed to exhaustion and fell asleep. His dreams were filled with confused images of his mother, the street, the police officer who arrested him. But above all, he dreamed of freedom, of the simple desire to be home again. The next morning, news of Junior's arrest began spreading on social media. Neighbors, outraged by the situation, started sharing videos of the moment of the arrest, and soon local news outlets were reporting on the case. Black teen accused of drug trafficking for carrying a mint became a headline, and Southside neighborhood became the epicenter of debates about racism and police abuse of power. O'Connor, upon seeing the case's media attention, was furious. "They're turning this into a circus. I was just doing my job," he complained to Davis, who once again remained silent. However, inside, he was beginning to question his loyalty and morality. He knew something was deeply wrong with all of this, but the fear of retaliation kept him silent. At the same time, a group of civil rights activists decided to support Lucia and Junior. Led by Mariana, a young lawyer passionate about social justice, the group began organizing protests and finding ways to pressure the authorities to review the case. Mariana, a determined woman with eloquent speech, soon contacted Lucia, offering legal help and promising to fight for Junior's release. Lucia, initially skeptical, reluctantly accepted the help, but soon realized that Mariana was willing to go beyond the basics. She wasn't just a lawyer. She was an active voice against the injustices frequently plaguing the Black community. As the case gained notoriety, the date for the first hearing was set quickly. O'Connor, now under more public pressure, began to adjust his narrative. He contacted former informants and tried to build a story where Junior would be part of a drug ring, manipulating evidence to make the accusation more solid. Meanwhile, Mariana and her team prepared to dismantle the case, basing their defense on the fragility of the evidence. A single mint? The tension in the courtroom grew as the hearing day approached. Mariana knew she was facing a tough battle, not just against the system, but against a police officer willing to do anything to preserve his reputation. The morning of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, Junior's friends, and onlookers gathered to follow the trial, which had become the center of a national controversy. Junior, sitting next to Mariana, was nervous but kept his gaze steady. He knew he had to trust the lawyer, but fear still gripped him. His mother, Lucia, sat in the front row, gripping her hands tightly as she watched her son. Officer O'Connor arrived with the confidence of someone who saw himself as untouchable. To him, this was just a formality. In his mind, Junior was already condemned, and he had total control over the narrative. His partner, Davis, sat beside him, visibly tense. He knew that the path O'Connor was taking was dangerous, and that the lies were beginning to pile up in a precarious way. The prosecution began with a straightforward speech, pointing to Junior as a rising element in local trafficking and linking him to supposed gang members in the area. O'Connor, when called to testify, described the incident as a routine act of cracking down on trafficking, downplaying the violence with which he approached the boy and mentioning the mint as suspicious and potentially a drug. Then it was Mariana's turn. She stood up calmly, her presence dominating the courtroom. "Officer O'Connor," she began, with a sharp look, "can you tell us what exactly the evidence was that led you to accuse Junior of trafficking? A substance that could be mistaken for drugs in disguised packaging," the officer replied, with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed his lies. Mariana approached the evidence table and held up the mint. "Is this the disguised substance?" The tension in the air was palpable. She then turned to the jury. "We're here to discuss a mint that was taken as contraband, as trafficking, based on the officer's prejudiced assumptions." O'Connor shifted in his seat, feeling the heat of the pressure. Mariana, seeing his discomfort, pressed further. "Is there any other evidence, besides this mint, linking Junior to trafficking? Witnesses? Drugs? Money? Anything besides your perceptions?" The silence in the courtroom was deafening. O'Connor hesitated, then answered, "He was acting suspiciously." Mariana turned to the jury again. "Acting suspiciously? In other words, being a young Black boy walking home after buying a mint?" The prosecution tried to intervene, but Mariana continued, raising her tone and the strength of her words. "We are here because a young man was judged not for what he did, but for what he represented in the eyes of a police officer. This is not just about Junior. This is about how the system treats those born with the wrong skin color in the wrong place." The hearing was adjourned for the day, but the courtroom battle was far from over. What Mariana didn't know was that, behind the scenes at the police station, O'Connor was beginning to move his darker pieces. He knew that if Junior were acquitted, His career would be in jeopardy, and he wasn't willing to lose. In the weeks that followed, Mariana and her team dug deep into O'Connor's past. They were shocked to discover that he had already been the target of several complaints of abuse of authority and racist behavior, though none of the allegations had resulted in punishment. At the same time, O'Connor tried to plant new evidence against Junior, turning to dubious contacts to make it seem like the boy had ties to local trafficking. O'Connor's partner, Davis, began feeling the weight of guilt. More and more tormented, he found himself torn between loyalty to his friend and the sense of justice that had always guided him in his career. Deep down, he knew O'Connor was manipulating the facts, but he still couldn't find the courage to act. Mariana, for her part, began crafting her final strategy. She knew she needed something more, something that would completely dismantle the prosecution's narrative. That's when a new witness came forward. Ricardo, a young man who had known Junior since childhood and who had witnessed O'Connor's approach from a nearby window. He told Mariana how everything had happened, making it clear that the officer had taken an aggressive stance without justification. Mariana, confident, decided that Ricardo would be the key to dismantling the case. But meanwhile, behind the scenes, O'Connor was becoming more dangerous. He knew that if Mariana succeeded in proving his misconduct, his career could end. One night, Mariana received an anonymous phone call. A dark voice warned her to drop the case, insinuating that her life could be at risk. Initially, she didn't take the threat seriously, but a few days later, her car was vandalized and her office was broken into. It was clear that O'Connor was willing to go beyond lies to protect himself. Even so, Mariana refused to back down. She had a clear goal: to prove Junior's innocence and expose O'Connor's police abuse. But at the same time, she began to take more precautions, moving carefully and always accompanied by security provided by the activists supporting her. Meanwhile, Davis, increasingly troubled, reached the breaking point of his conscience. One quiet night, he went to Mariana's house and, in secret, offered to testify against O'Connor. He knew it would mean the end of his career, but he was willing to pay the price to correct the wrong he had done by staying silent. On the final day of the trial, the courtroom was even more packed than before. The tension was palpable, and the number of journalists had doubled. Everyone was eagerly awaiting the conclusion of a case that had now become one of the biggest discussions about racism and justice in the United States. Mariana, confident, began presenting her surprise witness, Davis. The officer took the witness stand, and O'Connor's shock was visible. When questioned, Davis hesitated for a moment, but then began to speak. "I was there that day. I saw what happened," he said. "The boy, Junior, wasn't trafficking. He was just going home. O'Connor, he overreacted. He wanted an arrest, and he was willing to make up a story to justify it." The courtroom was silent as Davis's words echoed. The prosecution tried to discredit his testimony, but Mariana had everything planned. With a series of pieces of evidence including videos, witness statements, and documents revealing O'Connor's history of misconduct, she completely dismantled the prosecution's case. The morning of the final verdict arrived with a palpable tension that filled every corner of the courtroom. The headlines of the day's newspapers were filled with images and reports about Junior's case, and the entire country seemed to be following every detail. The courtroom was packed, not only with those directly involved in the case, but also with civil rights activists, journalists, and many onlookers eager to see how this battle between justice and injustice would unfold. Junior, wearing a clean but simple shirt, sat next to Mariana, his lawyer, who was focused, with a stack of documents on the table. Her face showed firmness and determination. She had prepared her case meticulously, knowing that this moment was crucial not just for Junior's life, but for the entire community that saw in him a symbol of the fight against abuse of power. On the other side of the courtroom, Officer Ryan O'Connor sat beside the prosecution, his expression rigid but uneasy. Although he tried to maintain his usual confident demeanor, it was clear that things had become more complicated than he expected. Davis's testimony, revealing the truth about the manipulation of facts, had deeply shaken his position. But O'Connor still believed he could get out of this. After all, he was a cop, part of an institution that traditionally protected its own. In his mind, A stain on his name would be hard to swallow but not impossible to circumvent. The judge, an older man with a face weathered by years of experience in the justice system, entered the room. Everyone stood as he took his position. The tension in the air was thick, with glances exchanged and muffled whispers throughout the room. "We are here to deliberate on the case of the state versus Junior Diaz," announced the judge. "The evidence has been presented, the witnesses have been heard, and now it is time for the final arguments before the jury begins its deliberation." The prosecution spoke first. The prosecutor, visibly frustrated by the recent developments, tried to defend the accusation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are talking about a boy who, despite his young age, was involved in suspicious activities in an area known for drug trafficking. He was found with a substance in his pocket that, while not a drug, raised all the suspicions. What we must consider is the context. He was in an area where trafficking is a daily reality, and Officer O'Connor's actions were in defense of the community. We believe that the boy's behavior and his association with elements from the neighborhood indicate a dangerous inclination. This case is not just about a mint. It's about the need to keep our streets safe." The prosecutor spoke energetically, trying to salvage some credibility for the case, even with the fragile evidence. But his words felt hollow, lacking the strength of a solid argument. Then it was Mariana's turn. She stood slowly, looked at Junior, then at the crowd in the courtroom. Every movement of hers seemed calculated, with an imposing presence despite her young age. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice calm but firm. "Today, we are here for more than just deciding the fate of a boy. We are here to determine whether justice can truly prevail in a system that, too often, fails to protect the innocent. Junior is not a criminal. He is not a drug dealer. He is just a 14-year-old boy who was walking home after buying a mint. He wasn't involved with drugs, he had no connection to trafficking, and there was nothing to justify the aggressive approach and unjust arrest he suffered." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "But what we are witnessing here is not just the mistake of one officer. What we are seeing is a pattern of institutionalized racism, where young people like Junior, because of the color of their skin and where they come from, are constantly viewed as guilty before they are even heard. They are suspects, easy targets for those who are supposed to protect them." She walked slowly around the courtroom, making eye contact with the jury members. "What happened to Junior is not an isolated case. This happens every day in many parts of the country. Young black men routinely treated like criminals, while their only guilt is existing in a system that marginalizes them. The prosecution wants you to believe that Junior was involved in something suspicious because he was in a trafficking area. But do you know what he was really doing? He was walking home. And what did he have in his pocket? A mint. Nothing more." She then addressed the jury directly. "If we allow this kind of injustice to continue, if we accept that a young man can be arrested and accused of trafficking without any evidence beyond prejudiced assumptions, we will be failing not only Junior but an entire generation of young people who deserve to have their lives respected. This courtroom is a place where truth must prevail, where justice must be blind to differences of color, background, and class. I ask you, today, to show that there is still justice in this country. Acquit Junior, and show that we will not accept an innocent life being destroyed because of prejudice." Mariana returned to her seat. The courtroom was in absolute silence. Her words had struck deep, and even the most hardened members of the jury seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The judge then instructed the jury to retire for deliberation. The room remained in suffocating suspense as everyone waited for the jury to return with a verdict. The hours that followed felt like an eternity for Junior. He looked at Mariana, who smiled at him encouragingly, and at his mother, who never stopped whispering prayers. Finally, the jury returned. Everyone stood. The judge called for silence as the jury foreperson stood to read the verdict. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, we, the jury, find the defendant, Junior Diaz, not guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and exclamations of relief. Mariana hugged Junior tightly, while Mrs. Lucia wept, embracing her son with the gratitude and love of someone who had almost lost what she cherished most in the world. O'Connor, however, remained motionless, his face a mask of frustration and anger. He knew that this meant the end of his career. With Davis's testimony and evidence of his misconduct, the system he thought would protect him would now turn against him. After the trial, Junior returned to his routine, but nothing was the same. Though acquitted, he carried the weight of an experience that had changed him forever. But with his mother and the friends who stood by him, he began to rebuild his life, determined not to let injustice define his future. Mariana, now more respected than ever, continued to advocate for young people like Junior, determined to fight against a system that, for too long, had marginalized so many. She knew the battle was far from over, but she was ready for each new fight. And so, in a modest New York neighborhood, Junior's story became a symbol of resistance, courage, and justice. He was no longer just the boy wrongly accused of trafficking. He was the boy who, with the help of brave people, faced the system and won.